Spruce Creek Valley, Montana Territory. November 1881. While his neighbors stacked cordwood for the brutal winter ahead, Jacob Wenzel was doing something they'd never seen before. Something they called wasteful, foolish, a immigrant's madness. He was filling his cabin floor with stones. Not building on stone. Not using stone for a foundation. Filling the entire floor cavity, 18 inches deep, with river rock, sandstone, and limestone. Over 4,000 pounds of it. Then covering it with planked timber as if nothing unusual lay beneath. "You've lost your mind, Wenzel," Thomas Bradley told him, arms crossed outside the half-finished cabin. Bradley had built 17 cabins in the valley. He knew it worked. That's a cold floor. Stone draws heat right out of a room. Everyone knows that. The other settlers agreed. Stone was for foundations, for keeping cabins level and dry. Not for wasting space that could hold stored food, or simply be hollow and easier to build. Certainly not for deliberately placing beneath your feet, where it would leach warmth from the very air you needed to survive. But Jacob Wenzel had learned something in the Bavarian Alps that these American frontiersmen hadn't. Something about heat that seemed to contradict common sense, until you understood the physics. What did this Austrian stonemason know about thermal mass that experienced builders missed? And why would filling a floor with thousands of pounds of rock become the difference between comfort and misery when January temperatures plunged to 20 below zero? If you want to discover frontier engineering that modern builders forgot, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Jacob Wenzel arrived in Spruce Creek Valley in May 1881 with his wife Anna, 2 children, and knowledge passed down through 4 generations of alpine builders. In the Bavarian and Austrian highlands, where winters buried villages under 10 feet of snow and temperatures stayed below freezing for months, his family had learned to build homes that stayed warm with half the firewood their neighbors burned. The principle was simple, though it seemed backwards to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Cold stone becomes warm stone, and warm stone stays warm. You're building a heat bank, his grandfather had told him when Jacob was 12, watching the old man lay river rocks beneath their cottage floor. Fire is quick. Stone is patient. Fire burns and dies. Stone remembers. Now, in Montana Territory, Jacob was applying that same principle. But everything about it looked wrong to American eyes. Thomas Bradley watched him work one afternoon in late September, genuine concern on his weathered face. "Wenzel, I'm not mocking you. I'm trying to help. That stone floor is going to pull heat right out of your cabin. Basic thermodynamics. Cold mass draws warmth." Jacob looked up from his work, sweat on his brow despite the cool autumn air. He'd spent 2 weeks hauling stones from the creek bed half a mile away. River-smoothed granite, dense limestone, sandstone worn soft by water. He'd sorted them by size and type, placing the densest stones at the bottom, the moderately porous ones in the middle layer, the lighter sandstone near the top. 18 inches of carefully arranged geological heat storage. In winter, Jacob said in his thick accent, cold stone becomes warm stone. Then warm stone becomes furnace. Bradley shook his head. That doesn't make sense. Stone can't generate heat. Stone not generate, Jacob agreed. Stone hold. Store. Release slow, slow, slow. All night. Into morning. While you sleep. The conversation went nowhere. Bradley left convinced Wenzel was wasting time and material on a fundamental misunderstanding of how heat worked. He mentioned it at the general store the next day. Within a week, Wenzel's stone floor had become a running joke in the valley. Heard Jacob's building a cold storage cellar. One settler quipped. Except he's planning to live in it. That's 4,000 pounds of rock, another said. Could have built 2 cabins with the time he's wasted hauling stones. Even Anna Wenzel had doubts. Jacob, the children's feet will be cold all winter, she said one evening as he continued laying stones in the crawl space beneath where their floor would sit. Trust me, he said quietly. By January, this floor will be warmest place in valley. Children will sit on it, play on it, sleep on it when very cold. She wanted to believe him. But looking at that massive bed of stone, cold to the touch in the autumn air, she couldn't imagine how it would ever be anything but a heat sink. Jacob finished the stone bed in early October. Then came the critical part, the floor itself. He didn't just lay planks directly on the stones. He created a 2-inch air gap using cross-laid timbers, then planked over that. The air gap would allow heat from the fire to circulate beneath the floor, warming the stone mass from below while the room warmed from above. "You're making it worse," Bradley told him when he saw the air gap. "Now you've got cold air flowing under your floor, too. You've built a refrigerator, Wenzel." But Jacob understood something Bradley didn't. Thermal mass only works if you can heat it efficiently. The air gap wasn't a flaw, it was the entire mechanism. Warm air from the firebox would flow beneath the floor, transferring heat to 4,000 pounds of stone. The stone would absorb that heat slowly, steadily, for hours while the fire burned. Then, long after the fire died, the stone would radiate that stored heat back upward through the planks into the living space. It was a thermal battery, a heat bank, a stone furnace that burned no wood and produced no smoke, yet could keep a cabin warm through the coldest night. The settlers didn't see it. They saw a strange floor, too heavy, too complicated, built on immigrant superstition. When the Wenzel family moved into their completed cabin in late October, the jokes continued. "How's that ice rink treating you, Jacob? Need to borrow some firewood when your stone freezer doesn't work?" Jacob just smiled and kept stacking his winterwood supply. He needed less than half what his neighbors were gathering. But he didn't tell them that. They'd learn soon enough. To understand why Jacob Wenzel's stone floor worked, and why it seemed so counterintuitive, you have to understand 3 fundamental principles of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and thermal mass capacity. Thomas Bradley was right about one thing. Stone does conduct heat. Touch a cold stone, and it feels colder than cold wood, because stone pulls heat from your hand faster. But Bradley made the mistake most people make. He confused thermal conductivity with thermal mass. Thermal conductivity is how quickly a material transfers heat. Thermal mass is how much heat a material can store. Stone has moderate conductivity, but exceptional thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly, stores enormous amounts of it, and releases it slowly over time. The specific stones Jacob chose mattered enormously. Granite, with its dense crystalline structure, could store approximately 0.2 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Limestone held slightly less. Sandstone, being more porous, stored heat less efficiently but released it more readily. By layering these different stones, Jacob created a stratified heat battery with different charge and discharge rates. The numbers were substantial. For 1,000 pounds of mixed stone, heated from an average of 35 degrees Fahrenheit to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, would store roughly 40,000 BTUs of thermal energy. To put that in perspective, burning 1 pound of dry hardwood releases about 8,000 BTUs. Jacob's floor, once fully heated, held the equivalent energy of 5 pounds of burning wood, but released that energy over 10 to 12 hours instead of 1. The air gap beneath the floor was equally critical. Without it, only the top surface of the stone bed would heat effectively. With it, warm air from the firebox could circulate through the entire 2-inch space, contacting and heating stones throughout the thermal mass. Jacob had essentially created a giant radiant heating system, powered by thermal storage rather than continuous combustion. His fireplace design complemented this perfectly. While his neighbors built standard front-facing fireplaces that radiated most of their heat straight up the chimney, Jacob built his at a 45-degree angle in the corner of the cabin. This orientation directed heat flow along 2 walls and, critically, allowed him to extend the firebox lower than typical, with the fire burning just 6 inches above the subfloor air gap. The result was a heat distribution system far more efficient than anything his neighbors had built. Approximately 60% of the fire's heat went into warming the room directly. Another 25% circulated beneath the floor, charging the thermal mass. Only 15% escaped up the chimney, compared to nearly 70% in a standard frontier fireplace. But the real genius appeared in the discharge cycle. When the fire died around midnight, as frontier cabin fires typically did, with families asleep and no one to tend them, the stone bed still held thousands of BTUs. As room temperature dropped, the stones released their stored heat upward through the plank floor. The rate of release was slow and steady, governed by the temperature differential between the stones and the air above. Local records from nearby Fort Benning noted that winter nights in Spruce Creek Valley typically saw cabin temperatures drop from 65 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight to 45 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn, a 20-degree swing that left families huddled under every blanket they owned. The Wenzel cabin, oral accounts later indicated, experienced drops of only 8 to 10 degrees, maintaining temperatures in the mid-50s even on the coldest nights, with no fire burning. The physics was elegant. While his neighbors' cabins lost heat rapidly through thin wooden floors to the frozen ground below, Jacob's cabin lost heat into 4,000 pounds of stone that had been warmed all evening. Those stones then became the heat source, radiating warmth upward while the frozen ground 40 inches below remained thermally isolated by the massive stone buffer. Thomas Bradley never understood this. He saw cold stone and assumed it would stay cold, draw heat, make the cabin colder. He didn't grasp that cold and warm are relative terms, and that thermal mass doesn't care about current temperature, only about temperature change and storage capacity. Stone doesn't generate heat, but once heated, stone becomes a furnace that burns no fuel and asks for nothing but time. In the bitter Montana winter about to arrive, that distinction would become literally life-saving. January 12, 1882. The temperature in Spruce Creek Valley hit 18 below zero. It would stay below zero for the next 72 hours. This wasn't unusual for Montana territory. What was unusual was that it followed a relatively mild December, lulling settlers into complacency. Many families had burned through more firewood than planned during the early winter, assuming they have time to cut more. Now, with the extreme cold settling in and snow 3 feet deep, cutting and hauling would become dangerous, exhausting work. Thomas Bradley's family was burning wood faster than he'd anticipated. His cabin, well built by frontier standards, required constant fire tending to maintain livable temperatures. At midnight, with the fire roaring, his main room held at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. By 5 in the morning, with the fire reduced to coals, the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. His children slept in their clothes under piles of blankets. His wife stuffed rags around the doorframe to block drafts. 2 cabins away, Jacob Wenzel's family was sleeping in lighter bedding. Anna had actually opened the loft window slightly at midnight because the upper floor had reached 71 degrees Fahrenheit and felt stuffy. The difference was the stone floor. After 3 months of winter use, Jacob's thermal mass system had reached full operational capacity. Every evening, his corner fireplace burned from 4 o'clock until midnight, 8 hours of steady heating. During that time, the room temperature stabilized around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But more importantly, the 4,000 pounds of stone beneath the floor absorbed heat continuously, its temperature rising from an average of 60 degrees Fahrenheit in late afternoon to approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. When Jacob banked the fire at midnight and went to bed, his neighbors' cabins began their nightly temperature plunge. His didn't. The stone floor, now 25 degrees warmer than the room air, became the heat source. Radiant warmth rose through the plank flooring at a steady rate, replacing heat lost through the walls and roof. By 5 in the morning, while Bradley's cabin had dropped 21 degrees, the Wenzel cabin had dropped only 7 degrees, holding at 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The children were sleeping on top of their blankets, not under them. Anna had placed her bread dough on the floor to rise overnight, something impossible in a normal cabin, where floor surfaces became the coldest part of the room. The wood consumption difference was even more dramatic. Bradley burned approximately 40 pounds of split hardwood that night and had to get up twice to add logs. Jacob burned 30 pounds and never left his bed. Over the 3-day cold snap, Bradley's family burned 180 pounds of precious wood. The Wenzels burned 110 pounds and stayed noticeably warmer. This is the kind of frontier engineering that saved lives. If you're learning something here, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments what temperature it is where you're watching from. But the real test came on January 14th, the coldest night of the winter. Outside temperature, 22 below zero. Wind gusting to 30 miles per hour. The kind of night where poorly built cabins became death traps and even good cabins struggled. Thomas Bradley burned through 25 pounds of wood before midnight. His cabin held at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, but he knew the overnight drop would be severe. He stacked extra wood by the fireplace, planning to wake at 3 in the morning to add logs. A miserable but necessary task on extreme nights. Jacob burned his standard evening fire, slightly larger than usual, but nothing excessive. At midnight, he banked it as always. His stone floor had reached 88 degrees Fahrenheit, measurably warmer than previous nights because he'd started the fire an hour earlier and fed it more consistently. That thermal mass was now storing roughly 45,000 BTUs, ready to release them slowly through the dark hours ahead. At dawn, Bradley woke to a cabin temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit despite his 3 o'clock fire tending. His water bucket had a thin layer of ice. His children were cold despite being fully dressed under blankets. The Wenzel cabin registered 57 degrees Fahrenheit. No ice, no suffering. The stone floor was still noticeably warm to bare feet, though it had cooled from 88 degrees Fahrenheit to approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit over the 7-hour night. It had released 20 degrees worth of stored heat, roughly 36,000 BTUs, into the cabin air, providing steady, silent warmth while the family slept and the fire laid dead in the hearth. When Anna came to Thomas Bradley's cabin that morning to check on his family, she found them exhausted from cold and disturbed sleep. "Come to our cabin," she said simply. "Bring the children. Have breakfast. Get warm." Bradley was too cold and too tired to be proud. He gathered his family and walked through the bitter morning to the Wenzel cabin. When he opened the door, the difference was immediately obvious. The air was warm. The floor was warm. The children were playing in their regular clothes, not huddled in coats and blankets. He stood in the center of the room and looked down at the plank floor beneath his feet. You couldn't see the stones. You couldn't hear them. You could only feel the gentle, steady warmth rising through the wood. "Your floor is warm," he said quietly. "Stone, remember," Jacob said. "All night, stone, remember the fire." Bradley knelt and placed his palm flat on the floor. It was warmer than the air, warmer than the walls. A giant, silent heat source that asked for nothing and gave everything. "I was wrong," Bradley said. Jacob nodded. "In the Alps, we have saying, cold stone is not enemy, is friend who is sleeping. You wake him, he work all night." By February 1882, Thomas Bradley was tearing up the floor of his own cabin. He hauled stones from the frozen creek, breaking ice to get them, sorting them by density, just as Jacob had showed him. He built the air gap, laid the thermal mass, replaced his flooring. His family spent 2 weeks living in the unfinished cabin, but by March, they had their own stone floor system, and their wood consumption had dropped by nearly 40%. Others followed. By late 1882, 11 cabins within 30 miles of Spruce Creek Valley had incorporated stone thermal mass floors. The technique spread through word of mouth, settler to settler, each builder adding their own modifications. Some used fired clay bricks mixed with river stones. Others experimented with different air gap heights or stone arrangements. But the core principle remained: heat the mass, let the mass heat the home. The local trading post began noting the trend in their records. Families with stone floors purchased significantly less firewood and lamp oil than families without. The difference was measurable, consistent, and economically significant. In a frontier economy, where firewood represented both money and grueling physical labor, a 40% reduction in consumption was transformative. Jacob Wenzel's design contained no revolutionary materials. River stones were free. The principle of thermal mass had been understood in various forms by builders from ancient Rome to medieval castles to Austrian alpine cottages. What was revolutionary was applying it systematically in the American frontier context and proving its value through direct comparison with standard building practices. The stone floor's effectiveness depended on multiple factors working together: sufficient thermal mass, efficient heat distribution via the air gap, appropriate fire management, and adequate insulation in walls and roof to minimize heat loss. Remove any one element, and the system's efficiency dropped significantly. Jacob understood this intuitively, having grown up with such systems. His American neighbors had to learn it through careful observation and, occasionally, expensive mistakes. One settler built a stone floor, but didn't create the air gap. The stones never fully heated, and the system underperformed. Another built the air gap too large, 4 inches instead of 2, which reduced heat transfer efficiency and wasted structural space. But each failure taught lessons, and by 1883, Spruce Creek Valley had developed a standardized approach to thermal mass floor construction that incorporated the best practices from multiple builders. Thomas Bradley, who'd called Jacob a fool 18 months earlier, became one of the system's most vocal advocates. He helped 6 other families build stone floors and documented the wood consumption differences in detailed notes that still exist in regional historical archives. His conclusion, written in March 1883, was simple. A stone floor system, properly built, reduces firewood consumption by 35 to 45% in standard winter conditions, and by up to 60% during extreme cold snaps, when neighboring cabins require continuous fire tending. The technique eventually declined as more sophisticated heating systems became available: cast iron stoves, coal furnaces, and eventually central heating. But in remote mountain communities throughout the Rocky Mountain West, stone thermal mass floors remained in use well into the 1920s. A few are still functioning today in restored historical cabins and off-grid homesteads built by people rediscovering what Jacob Wenzel never forgot. The lesson wasn't really about stone. It was about understanding how materials and physics work together, and having the humility to learn from traditions developed over centuries in similar environments. Thomas Bradley and the other settlers had dismissed Jacob's floor because it contradicted their expectations. They saw cold stone and assumed it would stay cold. They couldn't imagine that the very property that made stone feel cold to the touch, its high thermal mass, was precisely what made it effective as a heat storage system. Modern building science now recognizes thermal mass as a critical component of energy-efficient design. Passive solar homes deliberately incorporate concrete, stone, or adobe mass to store daytime heat for nighttime release. Radiant floor heating systems use the same principle Jacob applied, though with electric or hydronic heat sources instead of wood fire. The physics hasn't changed, only the fuels and the materials. Jacob Wenzel lived in his stone floor cabin until 1897, when he moved to Helena to be near his grown children. The cabin stood until 1923, when it was finally dismantled. Settlers who visited it in its final years reported that the floor was still solid, the stones still in place, the system still functional after 4 decades of use. One visitor noted that even in summer, with no fire, the floor remained notably cool, evidence that thermal mass works both ways, storing winter's cold as easily as it stores summer's heat. It had proven something important, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours. The Austrian stonemason hadn't invented anything new. He'd simply remembered something old, and had the courage to build it in a place where everyone said it wouldn't work. If this story taught you something about forgotten frontier wisdom, give it a like and subscribe for more historical engineering that actually worked. Drop a comment. Would you build a thermal mass floor in your homestead? Let's talk about it. The stone floor that kept the Wenzel family warm through Montana's brutal winters wasn't magic. It was physics applied with patience and understanding. Cold stone became warm stone. Warm stone became a furnace. And a furnace that burned no fuel kept a family comfortable while their neighbors burned through half a forest. Sometimes the old ways weren't old because they didn't work. They were old because they'd been proven for centuries and had simply been forgotten by people who thought they knew better.